Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to start. Welcome to tonight's lecture about the Belgian collective Rotor and reflecting on their current preoccupations. Here to talk to us about their work is Maarten Gielen, who's one of their founding members. From 2005, Rotor has operated as a group of architects, designers, and other professionals that have been interested in the processes that shape a building and its making. And it's specifically the kind of flows of materials through the kind of construction industry in relationship to resources, waste, use, and reuse. As a result, their work combines the design and realization of architectural projects, as well as research into these kind of forces that shape the making of buildings. And that research is then disseminated through critical writing, exhibitions, and conferences. So working at both ends of the spectrum within the profession, Rotor explores the birth as well as the afterlife of buildings with their new project, Rotor Deconstruction, which facilitates material salvage and reuse in some larger scale projects. And hopefully we're going to hear more about that tonight. So as mentioned, Maarten is a founding member of Rotor, where he currently works as a designer, manager, and researcher. At Rotor, he collaborated on exhibition projects, including the Belgian pavilion at the 2010 Venice Biennale, that explored wear as a reaction to use with great creative potential within architecture. He also worked on the OMA Progress exhibition in the Barbican, where they sifted through the vast archive of OMA's incredible output and found a way to communicate that to a larger audience in a fun and interactive way. And that was in 2011. And then also in 2011, they did the Ex Limbo exhibition at the Prada Foundation in Milan. And in 2012, he was appointed visiting professor at the Geneva University of Art and Design. He was co-curator of the 2013 Oslo Architecture Triennale, which included Behind the Green Door, which was a vast exhibition on the challenges facing sustainable architecture today. He was awarded the Rotterdam-Maaskant Prize in 2015, and he last lectured at the AA in February 2014 on Objet Trouvé. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maarten. Please join me in welcoming him back to the AA.
Thank you. Maybe first of all to say that I know that this is not much of a title, and I choose it this way to allow me to do maybe something that is a little bit softer than the way I usually lecture, or the way most architects usually lecture in a kind of a bulletproof way. The things I will be talking about are things that are going on right now, or processes of thoughts that are still pretty much in shape. And so it's more kind of a softer approach that allows for critique and dialogue and questions and whatever afterwards. I hope that's fine with you. So, well, in terms of preoccupations, I think I do need to give a kind of a small introduction, which has to do with the history of sustainability, which is actually a very, very young notion. Sustainability, the word as we know it today, was actually invented somewhere around 1985. It has a kind of a pre-life before that. And of course the word already existed but was signifying something else. But sustainable, as in sustainable development, was invented by the Brundtland Commission, a commission named after Gro Harlem Brundtland. And so the formal name of that commission was the World Commission on Environment and Development. So you have to imagine a kind of as if a scene from a novel of Asimov or another science fiction writer, a council of wise men and women from all over the earth are brought together to think about the relationship of humankind with its planet, headed by a former head of state of Norway, and receiving the mission quite ambitiously to formulate an aspirational goal for the world community. I think in terms of design brief, this is kind of the ultimate that can be reached. Think about it, you are with a group of people for 3 or 4 years together, meeting at regular occasions, and the ambition is to formulate an aspirational goal for the world, for everyone, for everything. The way that they answered this impossible question was by putting forward the idea of sustainable development. Their answer was, well, we need development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think this is a sentence, anybody who's been to high school in the last 20 years has heard this sentence over and over and over. Yet, I think that it's worth standing still on these phrases for a while. So later, these sentences were translated in the conference in Rio in all kinds of different, more precise ways. But let's stick to the very basic definition. There's a few words standing out. One of them is the notion of needs. So. The ambition of sustainable development is to meet needs. That means that if you think that chocolate is a need, then there is such a thing as a sustainable chocolate factory. In this case, a factory operating by using solar panels on its roof, making what they claim is to be sustainable chocolate. If chocolate is no need for mankind, then there is no such thing as a sustainable chocolate. And the same goes for airports, trains, cars, chairs, whatever. First, you have to accept that something is a need before you can call it sustainable. And of course, the design community and a lot of other people have spent the last decades trying to understand what this notion of needs implied. A second very interesting idea is this notion of future generations. So actually, we are not talking amongst us, even if we would have like a representative system that represents everybody living on Earth today, we still would have no legitimacy taking a vote, because there's people that are not born yet, future generations, people that cannot be there, they don't exist yet, and yet we have to take them into account in the discussion. And this is a very important kind of opener, because it's undertakes the legitimacy of any kind of form of decision making. There's always room for somebody to say, well, I am talking in the name of the people that are not in this room, and we think that this is not the right decision. And if you're talking about people that are not in the room, well, the step is easily made to people, well, let's say first, those that are not born yet, okay, but there's also those that will never be in the rooms, the right rooms at the right time. There's also things that are non-human, like trees and animals and so on, that cannot speak, that you have to start, or that you can start taking into account according to this the definition. And so what we've seen over the past few decades is a kind of a translating of this abstract idea into a more operationable set of guidelines, ideas, and so on. And architecture has actually been at the forefront of this, maybe in the same way that architecture was kind of in the front of things when the postmodern movement came up. Well, the same could be said about sustainability. A lot has been driven by designers and architects, and of course also corporations. So, for instance, Siemens, which you know very well, or should know very well here in London, because they're a major player in the organization of your daily life. This was a presentation of the CEO of Siemens Belgium in Brussels, making an announcement about, they have a kind of a city ranking tool measuring how sustainable this or that city would be. And they come to a very, together with the economists I should add, they come to a very remarkable conclusion. And the CEO said, well, we've noticed after 20 years of research, something that is very striking. We see a strong positive correlation between wealth and environmental performance. And first thing you think is, well, of course there is a correlation. Probably the richer you are, the more you are dirty, or the more unsustainable you live. But actually, that's not the point he's getting at. What they remark is a strong positive correlation in the terms that the poorer you are, the more environmental unfriendly you are, which is a kind of a weird thing to think. So actually being poor is unsustainable, and the most sustainable countries or areas in the world are coincidentally also the richest. I'll get back to this point a little bit later. So we have this form of translation that has gone on in society. Again, if you need to think as an architect in terms of what is a facade, what does a facade look like that respects the needs of future generations, is a very abstract thing to say. If you say it needs to contain that much foam, well, that's something that you can work with. And so we arrive, I think the Dutch Post summarized it quite well. This is more or less the state of sustainability today, the kind of the ideas that underpin it. Hybrid cars, if you're an architect, isolation, the more the better, and insulation, sorry, and filters on diesel cars, and so on. So let's go a little bit further on this notion of sustainability. I think it doesn't take much examples to kind of understand that the notion has lost much of its strength and is being used in very weird contexts, in very contradictory ways. For instance, McDonald's France, that commits to using renewable energy made by burning waste, which they actually also produce there. So it's a kind of a snake eating its own tail argument. And a lot of schemes, a lot of utopian ideas, a lot of kind of bourgeois fantasies about what this notion could be. So we did an experiment during a period of 3 months in a small city of Leuven, which also hosts a university. We went around and we started taking pictures of everything that calls itself sustainable, going from a consultancy agency calculating CO2 impact, to vegan cooking lessons, to lectures by Walter Pauli, open door days at passive house construction, and so on. And what we did, we worked with Robert Surmont, who's a very talented painter. We selected a number of the pictures, really snapshots that we had taken in that period, and we asked him to translate them into paintings, to give them a kind of a detachment, to reframe them however he wants, and to kind of start analyzing in a very visual way you could say, I don't want to use symbiotics in terms of visual language, but you could say, let's say the visual language of the occurrences of sustainability in that area. For instance, here you see the open door, open house day at the passive house construction, where visitors are asked to put on these blue plastic bags around their shoes, kind of not touching the object that they are visiting, or brainstorm sessions in meeting rooms, or kind of scenes at the bio supermarket meat stand, but also cutting-edge solar panel company, a spin-off of the local university that went bankrupt after after the Chinese started subsidizing solar cell productions, and so on. And what we did is we showed these pictures in the same city as we had where we had found them. So the idea was to show Leuven to Leuven in a way, and that's also the reason why we use these paintings, because we didn't want it to become too direct. We didn't want people to look at the pictures and say, oh, this is the grocery where I go, or this is that person that I know. So a certain level of detachment. And we've been, I show this project as a kind of an example. I think it's one of the things that we need to do now, is to hold still, to take a moment and to look in a very critical way, in a very observative way, at what is going on in the name of sustainability. And I'll give a few examples. A very banal product that you all know, gypsum board, plaster board, in this case, cradle to cradle certified. Very simple product. It's basically 2 sheets of craft paper with plaster in between. But where does the plaster come from? The plaster is coming from a washing installation of the exhaust of coal-fired power plants. And so because of acid rain and so on, the NOx that is contained in the exhaust of coal combustion through European legislation needs to be washed before it can release. And the way they do that is they add calcium, which reacts and becomes gypsum. And so the gypsum of this coal-fired plant is or was up until maybe 15, 20 years ago a waste product with very few applications. And because it was a waste product, it allows this gypsum board to claim that to be a very sustainable product because it is actually using a waste stream to be manufactured. And so you have this very strange moment somewhere in this in the setup of this company. There is a kind of a line where something that by most people is considered very unsustainable, namely the combustion of coal to produce electricity, and something that is certified by one of the most severe schemes around, namely Cradle to Cradle, as something sustainable. So somewhere, when this truck drives out of this compound, it must cross a line from the unsustainable to the sustainable. Now, I think Cradle to Cradle is one of the things that we could spend at least a few days trying to analyze and criticize. The metaphor that is used in that book is consider a cherry tree, waste is not a problem, and so on. Well, but these are the industrial cherry trees that we are talking about. That's just a side note. Another project that I want to talk about is Masdar City, which I'm sure many of you know, kind of a very ambitious scheme to make a city in the desert close to Abu Dhabi. It's a scheme developed by Foster and Partners. To their credit, it's full of very interesting ideas, very interesting technologies, like using towers that catch colder flows of air going above the city, drafting them in as an alternative, a non-mechanical way of cooling down the city. The whole city was supposed to be raised on a platform so that electrical cars could do in the basement all of the connection. Now, when we look at Masdar City, which is this island of sustainability in a very literal way, that's I think one of the key images when we are talking about sustainability is this notion of an island, something that has that is detached from everything else. A city in the desert can be sustainable because it can be understood as an object. Well, when we look at Abu Dhabi, at Masdar City, and we start zooming out, you really soon notice that it is not a city in the desert, but a neighborhood at the outskirts of Abu Dhabi, in a neighborhood, let's say, that is very much financed by the oil industry there, and kind of attracts the global richness, or concentrate the global richness. And so this object is actually not or cannot be understood as this city or this neighborhood cannot be understood as an object. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Now, in the case of Masdar, something that is quite interesting is that I mentioned these cooling towers drafting the cold air in. In order to keep that cold air in the vicinity, Foster proposed to build a wall around the city, and this wall is also the end of the calculations that are being used. To give an example, the concrete factory is not inside the city, so the concrete production is not to be considered part of the sustainability calculations. The airport is not within the walls of that block, so it's not included. Everything that is outside the walls of the city is not to be considered part of the object that carries a claim of sustainability. And so this wall, this 50 centimeters of brick or whatever it is, separates again an island of sustainability from a planet of unsustainability. So we can start extrapolating this. If you have the whole world and the whole world is unsustainable, then the idea is to make small pockets of sustainability. That's the main design challenge. Like if you compare BREEAM, LEED, Cradle to Cradle, whatever scheme is preoccupied with some form of sustainable development, the first thing they need to do is set a boundary. They have to decide within which boundaries they are working. You cannot work with the model of the whole Earth at the same time. That seems to be the logic. And the idea is that, of course, the more and more of these small pockets that will form, they will start to become mega pockets, and these mega pockets will then have a force to take over eventually the whole planet. That is the kind of underlying idea of how sustainable development is put into practice today. Now, you notice that I'm quite critical about this notion and about how it's being operated. And I would like to go one step further than just being critical about it. I think that we need to find ways as designers, as architects, as humans, to start giving content to this notion. And I'll get back to that later. Or no, let's get into it right now. In the sense that, you know, when you are, say, a painter, and you are making a painting, you are not necessarily trying to correspond to a notion of art that pre-exists. You're not following a certain set of criteria for your painting, saying it needs to be square, it needs to be able to hang on the wall, it needs to be colorful, and people need to be able to buy it in some way. You're not necessarily following that scheme. In fact, most art that is celebrated today is celebrated because it defines what art is. In other words, adding a work of art to the growing collection of art already existing is kind of shifting a little bit how art is to be understood in today's world. And I would like to advocate that by using the word sustainability, we should see it as a way, we should actually do it, first of all, which is something that many of our colleagues have given up. And we should do it not to try and correspond to what is going on already, but to try and push this notion in a certain direction. To try and influence about what is to be considered sustainable today. Because if we succeed in doing that, we have a vehicle that is extremely powerful. Sustainable development is part of most national, most countries, their agenda. Most corporations make claims about sustainable development and so on. If we can influence, even in a tiny little bit, what that means, we can have a huge impact. And I think the moment right now is a very good moment to start doing that, because the way sustainable development, especially in architecture, has developed in the last, again, the last 2 decades, is kind of touching the limits of what can be done. We can go from single glass to double pane, we can go to triple pane, maybe we can add 4 layers or 5 or 6, but at one moment there's going to be enough glass in the damn frame. You know, there's a moment where it doesn't make sense to put more insulation foam in a building anymore. And that moment is more or less right now. In Brussels, I don't know the situation in the UK. In Brussels, we now have a mandatory equivalent of passive house standards for all new construction. I don't see a double passive house standard coming anywhere soon. This is kind of the limit of it. And so this opens up a very interesting opportunity in the sense that what's going to be the next subject, the next way that the construction industry is going to make claims about sustainability now that they've exhausted this one. And our bet is that it's going to be about materials, not necessarily only during the construction phase, but in a more, in a different way. And this is where it gets messy. Or this is where I start being less sure about what I'm saying and kind of making proposals on the fly. I'd like to use this image, which is a statue actually in the city where I'm born but never lived, Aalst. And the statue is for a priest called Dans, which was a forefighter of workers' emancipation in the 19th century. Aalst was a typical industrial city in Flanders with large textile plants, very really scandalous exploitation of kids and grown-ups in these factories. And the statue is standing on a block of stone that is a Belgian blue limestone, which is quarried just maybe 30, 40 kilometers from that city. You can see it here again. And at first sight, the rest of the square is also made out of that Belgian blue limestone. Except when we zoom in on the material, we notice that even though it has the same color, it doesn't have the same drawing or the same texture. And this is actually quite a cheap imported Asian limestone, probably coming from Vietnam, quarried most probably in quite awful conditions. And so you have here a statue of a man that is an icon for this region, kind of the symbol of socialists. He was actually Christian, made his own political party and so on. But let's say worker emancipation, who is looking out over a sea of stone quarried in probably the most horrible conditions. And I think if this is the best sort of image that we as designers can create today, we really have a problem. Let's not even talk about the social implication. Just as an image, just at the scale of an image, this is a complete disaster. Or if somebody would put a caption on this, this is a super cynical and a super provocative installation. Actually, we proposed to the city of Aalst, we were asked to do a proposal for a public artwork. We proposed to move this statue to the quarries in Vietnam. They obviously turned down that proposal. So how do we manage those materials today, knowing that we have this notion of sustainability? And this is what we've been doing for the last few years. We have written sustainable development on a large flag, and we have started calling big corporations, and we have told them, in the name of sustainability, give me the keys of the building that you're going to take down, and give us a chance to see what we can do in terms of materiality in these buildings. And the buildings that we are working in are 5 to 10 years old, corporate headquarters of large stock-quoted companies. Actually, these are renters of the buildings that they use, and typically between every lease, the building goes back to its bare concrete skeleton. Most of the time they keep the outside skin, but everything else is gone. And so this is the sort of materials that we've been working with. And our proposal is quite simple. We remove from those buildings the salvageable components. We finance those operations. The client actually profits from them because the part of the materials that we take, he doesn't have to pay for demolition anymore, or a reduced fare for demolition. And we finance those operations with the sales of those components. So we moved about 600 tons the first year that we were in practice, and we're well on our way to increase that amount significantly in the coming years. So another place where you can go and wave with the sustainability flag, again, the sustainability flag doesn't mean that you're advocating a specific thing. You can advocate for a certain tree to be killed in the name of sustainability, and you can advocate for it to be kept with the same argument. It's a kind of a crowbar that opens up doors that you can use. It's a very, very strong tool because you're speaking in the name of those that have no voice. So you have millions of people behind you, and they don't have to be behind you. It's a very, very cool device. Let's say it like this. Again, I don't want you to be cynical about it, but think about what you can do with this in terms of design. For instance, we decided to start influencing policies to favor the usage of reclaimed components. This was a policy document written by the Flemish administration, claiming at first that salvage of building components is never going to work. We should put our energy into recycling. It's too messy, it's too small scale, won't ever work. One registered mail later, all of a sudden in the same text they say, the currently existing and flourishing reuse market is to be seen as a first step towards a more circular, blah, 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 and so on. So again, you can start influencing these documents and making the practices of a lot of people that are already existing all of a sudden not only meaningful, but also cutting edge and an example to be followed by another. And these are, we're talking about maybe at the scale of the Belgian territory, around 100 companies, most of them, well, all of them family-owned, small-scale operation that all of a sudden, in a vision document of the Flemish government, are to be seen as cutting edge and front runners for an evolution in the market. And this document, I mean, there's large corporations like Holcim and Heidelberger and so on that have put hours and hours of lobbying into these documents, and with very simple tools, with very simple arguments, we can turn the pancake around. Now, it's not a matter of public versus private. It's a matter of, let's say, opening up opportunities or opening up ways of working that are currently trapped within the realm of bureaucracy. The reason why large corporations do not give away or do not find new purposes for the materials they are about to throw away is that it is hugely impractical, and they expose themselves to huge liabilities. Now, the same goes for public commissioners. Imagine you are a worker at a certain city, you have a building to take down, you would like to give some of the materials away for free to some guy you know. The guy puts some work into it, spends 2 days demounting it, tries to sell it for 500 euros. All of a sudden, somebody comes out, says, well, he's selling it for 500 euros, but he gave it to him, so it's a form of corruption. Anyway, in terms of how to arrange public market transfer of material is a big cluster. Even though the example that I'm showing here is, the title is Sale for Demolition. Not longer than 100 years ago, buildings were frequently being sold for the materials that they contained. So within current legislation, within current practice, there are actually formulas, there are ways of working with these materials. You just have to get out of the simplified legislation and the simplified codes that public workers are using today. So we worked with a legal person that was in our office for about a year, and we made this manual that was sent out to public workers within the field of construction. It includes a number of these yellow forms, and it makes it as easy to commission a deconstruction project as it is today for decommissioning a demolition project. They basically just have to fill in the questions, choose a specific strategy and a target, have to choose, do I want to pay more or less, and so on, and that's it. And this sort of tool, rather than, I would say, or let's not give a counterexample, I don't want to offend anyone, but this is a very strong tool because it has potentially an impact and influence for the next 100 years to come. It's something that, as long as the laws don't change, and they don't change that often, will stay usable. Now, in terms of designers, there's of course other challenges than simply finding ways to obtain those materials. Imagine that you have a small building in detached parts. Here you see a hangar complete with structure, cladding, and everything. Imagine as an architect that you want to work with this building, a whole number of problems arise. For instance, do you buy the building first and then ask for a permit? Or do you ask for a permit first and then buy the building, hoping that it is still there, or hoping that you will get the permit if you have already bought it? Also, can you check if it is complete? Will your contractor give you your 10 years of warranty on the materials that he did not deliver? Can you get it in another color? Can you build only half of it? And so on and so on. Things that are very easy in AutoCAD, once you try to do them with physical materials, become quite complicated. And so our point of view is that we need a sort of service providers, companies that give the same type of service that is currently standard for new materials, that give the same sort of service for reclaimed materials. So, for instance, we made an annuary, a guide to those 100 companies in Belgium that already exist. A very straightforward way of working. A company called Jan Frank. What he does is he takes or he salvages bricks from the demolition, cleans them, delivers them on pallets, all the same size, all clean, guaranteed not coming from chimneys, not coming from buildings that were rot, and so on. And so you have all sorts of companies working with all sorts of materials, and we are starting to work with them to develop or to make it possible for these products to get inside the very formal construction industry. Because it's one thing to deliver this steel to some guy building a shed in the back of his garden. It's another thing to build a big building with this steel. And we have to get rid of a lot of kind of superfluous and very weird existing legislations. For instance, curb stones, like the stones that are on the edge of a boardwalk. You don't have to follow the code for prescribing this, but the most often quoted code for prescribing this material says that they all have to have the same length. I know very few designers that are obsessed with the length of the stones that they put in the boardwalk, but it is there. And once it is there, the contractor needs to comply to it. And so for the contractor, he cannot take these stones and put them back in. So he imports, again, a Chinese or Vietnamese similar looking kind of stone that is actually quite poor in quality. Not to say that all products coming from Asia are poor in quality, but this particular stone is quite poor in quality, and for no other reason than that 50 years ago, at the moment that the stone quarries in Belgium started their industrialization, they were trying to differentiate from a more artisanal way of working by having standardized formats. But is that still relevant today? So we rewrote that particular code or that particular technical description, and now it can be quoted by any architect in any project. Of course, when you do this, I mean, there is a lot of intelligence in these codes. There's things you need to keep in there. There's things you don't understand or you don't know, but you cannot just start removing everything that doesn't fit your particular program. So again, this takes us like 3 or 4 months meeting key stakeholders of the trade to understand why is this sentence actually in this text. And I think this is the interesting thing about reuse is that, okay, you can say And in the beginning, that was kind of the point of my lecture. You can say that we are trying to promote reuse, and so we are doing all these things, but you can also say the other thing. We are trying to undo some of the codes, some of the things we do in the architectural profession, some of the things we do in the construction industry. We're trying to undo them and see how they work, see how they hold up if we start changing them. And so this reuse of building components becomes actually an alibi to question what is an architect and what is his role in a project. Does it need to be separated from a construction company in any case? Is that like a dogma? Of course, it's law, but are there reasons to question this or not? Also, we can start rethinking what is work. For instance, we have we have this tile cleaning station, which is basically you have a pallet of tiles which have traces of cement on one side, you have a pneumatic hammer in your hand, and you need to clean the tiles and put them on the pallet next door. This you can do most of the time. There's absolutely no urgency. We can sell the tiles whether they are cleaned, or we can clean them just when they are ordered. Most of the time there is no urgency. So you could have some form of work where, let's say that you have somebody that is an artist, but sometimes in winter or whatever does not have enough work, could come to the workshop, being trained, do this work whenever suits him or her. And so, again, this is not something very typical in the construction industries, where workers have very strict hours and are very strictly controlled about how they do things and so on. Again, here, reuse of this material opens up a lot of doors. In terms of architects, well, let me be clear, there's certainly a place for architects in this process. When you're taking down a building, the skills you need are very similar to the skills you need for putting up a building. For starters, you have to be able to read a plan. This is the plan of one of our biggest projects to date. The plan is one thing, but the inventory of all types of asbestos that you can find in these buildings is a very, very important document. In this building, there were about 100 applications of asbestos used. So doesn't mean that there's 100 places where there's asbestos. There's 100 different ways in which asbestos was disguised in this building. So obviously it takes some skill to work with that. Another very stupid example, laziness and engineers go hand in hand throughout all the ages. The load-bearing capacity of this building was set by the engineer as the absolute minimum on the whole floor, which is not true. The floors around the elevator shafts can bear a lot more weight than other areas. But he just said, what is the legal minimum everywhere, making it very complicated for us to know where we have to store those 60 tons of granite that we're taking from a building. We had a subway station going through, like in a donut, through the building at the -6 floors. You can imagine, in terms of safety, especially in Brussels in that period, what kind of problems that gives. So all these things that we know architects are really good at during construction, well, they're also there during the construction, and there is there is certainly space for a lot more architects digging into this. I would say that there is also a really nice side effect on the architecture profession, and that's what we are seeing in our own projects. Given that we are we're very close to the execution when we are doing the construction projects, we actually should, maybe I should hide this, but we should actually very soon have our own separate company that is registered as a contractor, to be fair. But the sort of tools that we are learning there, they can be very handy in our design projects as well. Like, for instance, this was an intervention or a building, temporary building that we did for Galerie Lafayette in Paris, where we decided to raise an existing ceiling that was already there on one side for the natural light. Actually, the ceiling was cutting part of the window away, and Paris is not the most sun-filled city, so we wanted to open up that ceiling. At the same time, that ceiling has an acoustic performance, has light integrated, and so on. And so imagine trying to prescribe this as a professional architect in a design competition. The first thing any contractor does is get rid of this, because he didn't deliver the material. What if it falls down? Maybe I will have problems with connections or whatsoever. You cannot actually do this sort of thing from behind an AutoCAD file in a building. You actually don't know. You have one site visit, then you have 3 weeks to win the competition, and then maybe the thing gets built somewhere in the next 5 to 10 to 20. We were talking about it years, and so you can't really get away with prescribing interventions like this. So what we have now, our office is divided in two parts now. We have Rotor on the one side, which is in charge of design projects, consultancy missions, and so on. And then we have Rotor Deconstruction. Both of them employ about 10 people. What we have now is to be regarded as a sort of a prototype, a bit like this airplane. It's not flying, you know. It's not that we can say that it will that it is a model that is ready to take over the whole construction industry. But we have been able to test some wind speeds across the wings. We know what will definitely not work, and we are further expanding from there. And so it's quite fun to do our job these days. People call us with very strange questions, like a manège in laminated wood that needs to go by December. If we find somebody that wants it, we can get it for almost no money. Here's the detailed structure. Actually, we make also our own challenges, which is a thing that more architecture offices should try to kind of have at least some projects where you're in charge of the agenda, and that are not just pet project that don't have an economic viability, but that actually work. For instance, we noticed that there's actually like quite a lot of value in the hardware that is being used in buildings, but it's very difficult to sell because the value is so small per unit. So we came up with a distribution scheme. We had some prototypes same day, basically. We went to the printer, and now these are in shops, just mixed in between new products. Of course, on the package it says that it's a salvaged material, but I think to the naked eye, it's very difficult to know for a buyer whether this is a new or a second-hand product. And so I would like to end with this as a kind of an invitation, or to summarize the point that I was trying to make, is that deconstruction is a way for opening up the very controlled atmosphere that most architects are working in today. Architects that I know have a kind of a love-hate relationship with their profession, fighting with the contractor, fighting with the client, not understanding why they win or lose certain competitions. It's a very tough job. Everybody's stressed out all of the time, and we have this idea that maybe deconstructing the profession is a way to move forward. Thank you very much.
much, Martin. That was really eye-opening. I think what really struck me was the scale, the change of scale from the material to the process to the policies to then implementing that across the profession. And I was just wondering, just to start the question part of the evening off, if you could speak a bit more about how that works in your office. So how do you mitigate all the different time scales?
Well, yeah. Again, it's like that plane holding on stilts. It's not that we have a method that is bulletproof. Let's say that we always have a couple of design projects running at the same time, and we made a few sacrifices. We made it easier for ourselves to operate. For instance, we don't do competitions anymore. We only do direct commissions, even though for some clients a direct commission will just be a pitch for a few days of work. But what the things we do are paid. And there's no argument about that. And so that means that we do not have to have projects that earn a tremendous amount of money to pay for 5 competitions that we have lost. That also means that we don't have to change our staff every time we lose or win a competition. And I think that's a very important thing in our model, is that we are trying to develop a set of competences that are internal to our, or that we don't have to abort every 6 months, that we can grow. Yeah, I'll leave it to that.
And then just, I have one more question, which was, I think you talked about how you thought the future of sustainability was in materials, but I was wondering, like, what first led you to this idea of deconstruction as the kind of new definition of sustainability?
Well, I don't think that necessarily deconstruction is the only thing that is going to influence the debates on sustainability in the coming years. I do think that much will be about materials, and I think that's maybe something that is specific to the Belgian context that we are working in terms of, well, you know, or you should know about the constitutional mess that our country is in, with different regions, different languages, groups, a lot of responsibility in very small units. And so where other regions might hope for success by, or hope for sustainability by organizing, I don't know, shared warm water systems or those sort of things, planning those things in the institutional context of Belgium doesn't seem very viable. So I should be more specific and say that in Belgium it's going to be about materials. And also it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I am here tonight saying that that's going to be the thing that everybody is going to want to work on in the next couple of decades, a few people will pick it up. You know, that's a habit we took. In a way, this deconstruction stuff is a bluff. It's necessarily a bluff, because either the materials are not there if somebody wants to build with reclaimed materials, or there is no market when you have the materials. You have to bluff on both sides. You have to tell to one guy the materials are there, and you have to tell another guy and say the market is there. There's no other way to start doing this than by talking about it as if it existed. And so I guess that's what we have been doing, and you called it.
Does anyone have any questions in the audience?
Or remarks?
Sorry, I sat behind this one, so I couldn't stand up. Thanks so much for the lecture. I was wondering, apart from sharing your research on and sharing the way of taking down buildings in your research document, do you also make available the knowledge about how you actually went about it in the first place, and getting it through local authorities or whatever way? Do you share this really valuable information with other people?
So for the moment, what we are sharing is strategies and processes. What we are not necessarily sharing is ways of let me take another approach. Like, if you buy a piece of land and there happens to be oil or coal underneath it, you're sitting on top of it, right? So it's a resource you have, you extract it, and if you decide that you can refine it and make some product out of it, you have the whole stock below it, or a good part, at least enough to wear down the investment that you may not. The problem with reclaimed building materials is that it is a distributed resource, right? So everybody has a little bit of it. If you want to make an investment in, say, brick cleaning, and you publicize that there is no way to earn back the investment that you did on it. So you need a kind of a certain delay, because the processes are most typically not so complicated. And so there is a balance to be found, because on the one hand, we are interested by creating an industry, and actually we need to have an industry, because otherwise we cannot survive. You cannot tender systematically the use of reclaimed bricks if there's only one company providing them. You need a few companies, you need a market to be able for it to work. So that's one ambition on the one side, and of course there is a social and an environmental commitment to that idea from our side. But on the other hand, the investments that we make, we also have to find models where we are able to recuperate that money over a certain period of time. So that's a kind of a balance we need to strike.
Any others?
Thank you for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. I think what you're putting forward is super interesting in the agenda you're introducing for the architect, and also maybe a survival toolkit of the future of the architect. I was wondering, at one point in your presentation, you mentioned the fact that you have called companies to basically introduce them to what you do, or maybe if they can maybe provide you with some sort of a commission. I was wondering how well you've been received by them, and also how you have gained their trust by putting forward maybe something a bit more radical, something that maybe they're not very used to.
Yeah, it's actually a question for my colleague Odeline, who is in the back, because she's been knocking on a lot of doors to kind of get this idea inside. But basically, a good salesman speaks the language of the person that he's selling to. So if you notice that a certain company has the ambition of getting a few of their buildings BREEAM or LEED certified, you speak BREEAM. If a company starts talking about, I don't know, societal commitment or local economy or whatever, then you do that. We speak about our projects in a different way, for instance, to a municipality than to a company. And I think it's not a hypocritical, or it's not a cynical way of operating. It's just that a lot of people have, or a lot of different groups have developed other words to talk about things that are quite similar. And sometimes you need to help them to bridge the gap. So I would say that the response is quite good, but the question is always, is it operational? You know, is it an idea that we can implement with little or no additional cost, preferably a little bit of gain, because that means that it's much easier to advocate even the lowest worker in a company. If he's doing something that reduces cost, no boss will be offended. If it seems something that is taking him a lot of time and is adding no value to the process, then it needs to come from much higher up. And so it's a way of organizing the responsibilities, the process to take as less space as possible. For instance, one of the things you realize is that if the building site is delayed even 1 week because of your intervention, what that costs in potential rent revenue outweighs any benefits that you can offer. So you need to find ways of doing the inventory when the previous tenant is still in the building, doing the deconstruction actually in between the moment that he leaves and the time that the traditional demolition company needs to start up the works. And so then that means that in terms of staff, we actually work with technicians that come from cinema and theater and so on, events, because you can call them, they are there, they don't mind working long days, they have a different regime, or they work in a different way than a traditional. So it's this puzzle. You constantly need to make it fit into the existing practices.
Yeah, again, thank you for the lecture. I thought it was, thanks, cheers. I thought it was like really on point, basically, and it's kind of an issue that's been lacking from this room quite a bit. But I have a question which is kind of leading on from the last point, which is it possible that there's a financial incentive of calling you rather than the demolition company? Because I feel as if, as you put it, use the metaphor of the plane getting it off the ground, to get that plane off the ground, there either has to be a bottom-up financial incentive, or there has to be top-down legislation. And as you framed it earlier, this legislation doesn't always work, and the financial incentive isn't there. So I was wondering, and I know you kind of explained it in very lucid terms in your presentation, but if you could kind of summarize what you're doing that offers that incentive.
Well, to give you one example, the premium for renting a BREEAM or a LEED certified building is anywhere between 10 and 30% of the rent value. So that means that there is definitely an economic incentive for companies to go after these certifications. Then within the LEED and the BREEAM system, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's basically a kind of a Mario Bros goes around and collects points. Basically they will get 2 points for putting bike stands, they will get 5 points for treating their rainwater different from their grey water, and so on and so on. And reuse of building materials is a very, very cheap way of collecting those points as compared to, say, installing a very high-tech system to regulate the water flow of your sanitation devices, or sacrificing some parking spaces that have a lot more value than bicycle lanes on the same plot of land. So that's just one way for one certain type of company to explain a potential economic benefit. And then there is a very straightforward one, which are small. Like what we go after is projects that have a different scale, and because they have a different scale, we have a set of components that have more value than 50 separate doors. 50 identical doors have more value than 50 separate doors. They're also easier to market because you only need to take a picture of one, and then you can just sell them through a website, and you don't have to measure and take a picture of each one of them. So you could say that what we are doing right now is a bit like when you are making cream. You turn in the milk, the fat goes up, and we take the fat. There's a lot of milk underneath that, from a technical point of view, is very suitable for reuse, but from an economical point of view, we can't reach that low. So we are taking the few percentages of materials that are economically viable today. That's our strategy. And of course, we hope that there will be a major tax shift from labor towards raw materials. If that happens, then we'll have milk parties. But the movement in terms of political ambition towards that is very, very slow. Yeah.
Just a quick question. I was curious about the furthest distance that kind of recycled piece of building has traveled into a new project, you know, whether you're seeing the geography of recycling and reuse to be expanding, and how you think about, you know, sustainability in a context where perhaps the internet and other modes of communication beyond your, you know, contacting clients directly, you know, might expand that geography, and how to address that.
So we are based in Brussels, and we work, let's say, anything from Rotterdam to Paris along the high-speed rail. That's kind of our area of operation for extraction. Why Paris? Because there's a lot of deconstruction or a lot of demolition going on with Réinventer Paris and so on. And the agenda or there's a lot of political ambition to work there. And so we're trying to bridge that gap. That's in terms of extraction. Of course, the building sites that are closest home, because the overhead costs and the transport costs are much lower, we can extract much more. For Paris, we go there for the kind of the boutique projects in a way. And then in terms of putting on the market, you have to realize that 200 or 300 kilometers for a building material is local. Like if you talk about vegetables, traditionally you would have maybe within a circle of 20 kilometers you would have everything you need to feed yourself. Building products have always had longer distances because the wood comes from the German forests, the stone comes from the Belgian quarries, and so on. So there is more of a tradition in terms of distances. Now, that said, I would say that in weight, of course, 95% of our materials stay within, let's say, 100 kilometers around the deconstruction site. In value, because we have a web shop, lights and the occasional chair that we find, or doorknobs in bronze, or that sort of thing, they travel quite far. Let's say that we deliver regularly in France, Germany, and the Netherlands for the smaller stuff.
On eBay soon?
Yeah, well, it's a long story, why not, but...
Hi, I have a question about if you have any kind of strategy or thought about things that are not necessarily voluntarily demolished, but rather things like earthquakes or terrorist attacks or disasters, that is buildings that are falling apart and have many valuable things which can be salvaged, the same as from demolished buildings. And as opposed to a building that style has fallen out of favor and the things inside are kind of outdated, you might have a building with very precious pieces that can be salvaged and sold.
Yeah.
Like a new building or extremely preserved building with very valuable things, which are usually just scrapped away, if you ever think about that.
Well, we haven't had any earthquakes in the geographic area that we are working in, so it's a theoretical question, because I mean,
or terrorist attacks.
We are doing we had a few of those, but I think one of the issues that is very important is the conditions that we put, the way we organize the work. And I can imagine that, you know, if a few wooden beams, how nicely carved they are, go to incineration because there is no safe way to extract them, I think that's fine. You know, I don't want to particularly save every piece of wood. And on the other hand, if that building was that precious, then maybe those components should stay in that area. Maybe we could get a mission to extract them. So I'm not sure that the kind of catastrophe salvation is a way for us to go. However, one of the things that we are doing, it's not a direct answer to your question, but for instance, even today, an architect called me saying like, okay, we are renovating a super nice building from the 1800s, beginning of the 1800s. All of the copper door plates and so on are still there, but nobody wants to touch them because yeah, it's going to be like one piece missing and so on and so. They're not organized to taking them down. So we're going to have like a very, very small assignment just to number all the doorknobs, get them out of the building, store them the period that they're going to be renovating the building, and then deliver them in a nice bag with a number at the end of the building site. Or we worked in a building for a building of Henri van de Velde, the book tower in Ghent. We were called, and they told us, you can have all the shelves. We told them, well, do you know these are the original shelves? And they said, yeah, but nobody wants to, I mean, what do you want us to do? And we told them, well, write a call, write a call for price offers, and we'll send you in a bid to take them down, number all the pieces, make a detailed inventory, and deliver them back to you so that they are as easy to draw in the projects than the new system. So this sort of, because we are on the frontier between the drawn lines of the architect and the physical matter of the contractor, there's a lot of things we could do, like helping to make that bridge smaller. So I could imagine maybe that is a possibility. Yeah. Is nobody critical here? I'm really surprised. I made an invitation to attack, and nobody. No, don't feel obliged, but.
Any attacks? Maybe they want to do it more one-on-one.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Maarten for a really terrific, thought-provoking lecture.
Thank you.